insulation gallery.
Good evening. Welcome to the January 14th, 2019 meeting of the Stillwater City Council. I will call this meeting to order and ask you to stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. We have a pretty light agenda tonight and no meetings other than the council meeting, so we've got some exciting information we'll share, and let's get to it. So we'll start with item 3 on the consent docket. Councilors, any questions, comments, or items you'd like to remove from the consent docket?
Mayor, I'd like to remove item C, please.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, comments, or motions?
Motion to approve the consent docket minus item C.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the consent docket minus item C. Please vote. With a vote of 5-0, those items on the consent docket are approved. That'll take us down to items removed from the consent docket. We don't have anyone signed up to speak on items. All right. So item 5, Councilor Vice Mayor Darlington.
Yes, I was curious about the other bids and the things that were decided not to be included in the roof replacement, insulation, I think, and a variety of things.
Good evening, Jim Scott. We had 5 bids turned in. We had 3 alternates, and those alternates were different roof panels. So the ones that we went with, because of budget, you'll see the connecting screws that make those go in versus this other one, it hid those screws. Not a big deal, just something the architect threw in as an alternate. Alternate 2 was to replace the roof on the overhang that goes out the south door. And then the other was insulation for the building. There's insulation that's currently above the ceiling tiles that was done when the building was remodeled. Most of the insulation that's still on the metal of the old building has fallen off because it's old cellulose that was sprayed on, and throughout the years that has started to come off. Some of it's still there, but not a lot of it.
So you're not going to replace the insulation,
No, ma'am.
even the stuff that's coming
We
off?
still have, with the insulation that's above the ceiling tiles, and I can't tell you what the R value is. I can tell you it's pretty thick when you're trying to remove a ceiling tile and get in there and work, but there's a lot of batt insulation that's above the ceiling tiles. And for the most part, that's what's been insulating the roof, or the ceiling anyway.
And that's been there since a
When we
remodel versus
remodeled it, I don't remember the year we did that, but that's when Multi went to a new facility and the senior center was remodeled. It was opened up and they put in new drop ceiling, new lights, and they added the insulation at that time.
Insulation is such an important thing.
It is. It was just the cost versus,
How much more would that add?
we're at 67,000 with the bid now. Adding the insulation, we'd have to change companies that we award the bid to because Ground Zero didn't bid on the insulation part. And it would raise the cost to $105,735. So it was pretty healthy increase going with the second low bid that bid on the insulation part.
Can the installation be done later on an independent basis if it needs to be replaced?
Not installed this way, but yeah, the ceiling could be sprayed at a later time, but it couldn't be. This would be the real thin metal I say real thin, but the metal building insulation that's rolled out onto the metal panels and then put down.
It's like
That's what would
a
be
radiant
installed.
barrier.
Uh-huh.
Well, it just insulation is really
Well-
important in my own home.
And insulation, to be honest with you, the number 3 was added after the bids went out because I noticed it wasn't in there, so I made them add that to the bid because I thought also that while we have it off, it might be a good time to go ahead and put that in. It was just the expense was so much compared to what we had budgeted for the project.
Yeah. I'm sure some engineer can tell you how much you're losing in utility costs without insulation.
Well, I mean, that's, I guess, a question, right? Are we actually below where we need to be with that insulation, or we just thought we might replace it while we were in there?
I don't think we're below, just Jim's opinion. The architect that we used to help do this bid wasn't real big on needing to add insulation to this. So I think we're fine. The building's hard to heat and cool anyway, just because it's an old metal building and there's lots of gaps and it's concrete floors, and it's a tough building to climate control anyway. But it does have a lot of insulation in the ceiling tiles.
Well, it would be interesting to know the R value, although that means nothing to me.
Right, right.
And if it is a hard building to weatherize, I would think that any occasion to do something that does add some benefit would be a good thing.
You're probably right. Yeah.
And seniors like it warm?
They do. They like it warm or they like it cool. There's no good in between,
Yeah.
depending on the season.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Would you like to make a motion? Would somebody like to make a motion on this item?
If someone else would like to make a motion?
I will make a motion to accept item C in the consent docket.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to accept item C. Please vote. I didn't vote. No, I did. With a vote of 4-1, the item is approved. All right, that takes us to item 6, general orders. 6A, update on assessment of reserve policy, CC-19-07. Mr. McNichol.
I am lost. I apologize.
sorry.
I was making notes
We're-
on the
yep.
last item, make sure.
Jumped
we
forward
get our
quickly there.
values. Pardon?
I jumped forward kind of quickly there.
That would be Christy Platt. Finance Director is going to provide that report. Thank you.
Good evening.
Hello.
So just a reminder that at our October 1st council meeting, Melissa Reams led a discussion on reserve levels for the city. And then she indicated that staff would be bringing back a recommendation for the council to consider. I don't have a recommendation for you today, but I wanted to take the opportunity to provide you with an update as far as staff's progress on determining what that reserve level is. So first, I'd like to recap why a reserve is so critical. Reserves are the cornerstone of financial flexibility for an organization, and especially an organization of our size and with our diversity. So we have offer a wide range of services, recreation services. We have a full line of utility services, electric, water, wastewater, and solid waste. We have an airport and provide public safety services. And so we're very diverse, and a reserve allows us to mitigate the risks that we find with such diverse services, and also maintain service levels to our citizens and our customers that they've come to enjoy. So more specifically, reserves allow us to pay our recurring expenses in a timely manner, allow us to fund unanticipated expenses due to things like storm damage, things of that nature. Reserves allow us to hedge against times of economic downturn. which can have a significant impact on the revenues that actually come in the door. They allow us to maintain and improve our infrastructure on a more proactive basis. They allow us to meet our bond covenants and pay our debt service and maintain a good standing with our rating agencies. And that ultimately leads to more favorable interest rates as we go to issue bonds. And reserves also allow us to phase in rate adjustments when they're needed. So as we look at setting reserve levels, we want to keep in mind that a healthy reserve should be defensible, and it should be specific to the organization, not just an arbitrary dollar amount thrown out there. We also want to find kind of that sweet spot for the reserve. We want it to be enough to mitigate those risks that we have and to maintain the service levels, but we don't want it to be too much. So holding too much in reserves can lead to an unnecessary deferral of infrastructure improvement, or it may delay implementation of new program initiatives. And it may also be an indication that that we may have excessive user fees or taxes. So as staff has researched best practices in establishing reserve levels, we've been reminded of how important it is to develop unique reserve calculation parameters for the different kinds of funds that we operate out of. And so those funds that I'm talking about are enterprise funds and then also the general fund. And I'm kind of focusing on those two funds just because that's where the bulk of our activity is housed. So enterprise funds are those used to account for programs that provide services to the public for a fee. So these funds are operated much like a business and are intended to be largely self-supporting. The city's enterprise funds are the Stillwater Utilities Authority and the airport. So our enterprise funds are capital intensive, and they carry debt. And so when we're establishing those reserve levels, we want to not only provide for those contingencies that may interrupt daily operations, but we also want to provide for that ongoing repair and replacement of the capital assets, and also provide for that ongoing payment of debt. The general fund, on the other hand, is focused more on that general service delivery. And those general services are funded in large part by unrestricted taxes. So these services include public safety, recreation, and then the maintenance of our public infrastructure. And so when I use the term public infrastructure, I'm talking roads and bridges. So because the focus of the general fund is on service delivery and not that capital asset improvement or servicing debt, that calculation for the reserve would concentrate more on those O&M expenses. So a new concept, or at least new to this city, that staff is considering is the development of a city capital fund. And so this would fund our public infrastructure improvement and equipment purchases. Creation of this fund, it would solidify kind of the city's commitment to that improvement of public infrastructure, which we know is a priority of our citizens. So we're evaluating options for funding there because we would have to identify a funding source, and that could be just the transfer of a positive budget variance each fiscal year, or it could be a transfer of a set dollar amount, or maybe a combination of the two. We're also evaluating how a reserve may come into play with a capital fund, and if it's needed to plan for those contingencies that affect our public infrastructure. So as I mentioned, there's not an action item tonight. This is more of just an update. Staff is continuing to evaluate and perform an entity-wide risk assessment, which will play into the reserve calculation. We're also kind of refining our methodology for developing that reserve recommendation. And we plan to bring that full recommendation to you in March when we present the FY20 budget. So are there any questions that I could answer at this time?
Counselors?
No. Thank you for that nice explanation.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
really appreciate that. I think it's important for all of us to note it's important to note the importance of what you all are doing and the importance of a very thorough review of our reserve funds, how they're set, how we, what we say they're for, all of that sort of thing. Again, not to make sure we're not just sort of going, okay, well, here's all the stuff we've been doing forever, and we just kind of keep doing what we were doing, and you get to a point where nobody really knows when
Right.
something was set up or how it worked, and you've got to go back and look at it. So I think very important work you guys are doing. Appreciate the update, and we'll look forward to the recommendations in March.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Item 6B, presentation from Oklahoma State University on scooter contract.
I believe
Go ahead.
Vice President Weaver is going to introduce the people that are going to make that presentation.
Certainly do that.
And
Before I do, I should just say thank you for letting me be here. I have Mike Robinson, who is our Chief Public Safety Officer, Steve Spradling, our Manager of Parking and Transit, and Casey Schell, a new addition to our staff, who's our University Planner. They were on the committee that helped us vet the vendors and determine who would be the best fit for us. As I explained to the administration, and I should say, you can take what I knew about scooters and put it in a thimble last August. I never knew that I would be managing scooter programs as the Vice President for Administration and Finance. But
Amen.
figure, here we are. Here we are. And I'm very pleased with the work the committee's done. John helped us at the onset with the committee, as well as did a number of students. We, as you know, we just reached the point last fall that, not that it was chaos, but it was not organized, and we didn't feel comfortable. We were afraid people were going to get hurt, and we just felt the need to ban the scooters based on the operations of the scooter companies. And as I told the students in student government, it's not that we're against scooters. It was about these particular partners who really weren't acting as partners. Now we've selected a firm that we think is going to be a great partner. We'll be able to control speed, where they park, how many are on the campus, et cetera, et cetera. And the guys are here and can answer any questions you might have. We expect to spin this up, no pun intended, next week. We were wanting to get it through at the beginning of the semester, as we promised the students. We're close, so. And I've provided the contractual information in the RFP to the city attorney and to Norm, so that, because invariably there will be some connections with the city, although our project was within the confines of the university only. So with that, I'm going to let, if you have any questions, I'm going to let my guys respond to them.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver.
Thanks for having us. As he introduced me, I'm Steve Spradling. I know most of you, but not all, but I'm glad to be here. Appreciate that opportunity. I left you a handout at your desk earlier before I got here, just to cover some of the key notes and who the vendor is. We chose Spin. We did not choose one of the vendors that had been here in town. One of the vendors we definitely did not want to go with. The other one had tried to do things mostly right, but they did launch without approaching the university. So in the end, we chose one that had approached us prior to anyone launching last summer, and I told them we weren't ready at the time, and they said, we will not dump scooters like other companies do, and they didn't, and that was Spin, and that's one reason their integrity shined for us, and we chose them. Another reason we chose them was the best price for the students, and also they have a mechanism for parking enforcement to include phone pop-ups, emails, fines, suspensions of riders, and also in-app reporting of bad riders or bad parkers. And if you'll see the backside of our handout, it'll show some of the examples of that. So we're rolling out next Tuesday, January 22nd, deploying 200 to start with. One of the things we told them we wanted was we wanted to see them used, or we didn't want to see them sitting around. So we want to see them used 4 to 6 times per day each, or we don't want to see them. The ones that were here previously were not being used like that. As one faculty at OSU described it, it was vehicular litter, really. So we're trying to veer away from that. So as I mentioned, they're going to enforce parking. We are installing parking zones on campus right now. We've got about 15 of 50 initial zones installed already, waiting on materials to put down for the others, and they'll be done this week. I mentioned the rates, and then with the parking. Also mentioned the 4 to 6 rides, and then we will geofence certain areas. The parking spaces will be geofenced and on the maps where people will know where they're at. And the core campus will also have a geofence around it where the speed limit is reduced to 10 miles per hour on the scooters. And that's about all I had, but I wanted to leave something behind in case you had questions. You could look at it and see. And I've got some other handouts for anybody here that might want one.
Great.
And if you got any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
I think we probably have a few questions.
Okay.
Counselors?
I do have a question about the rates.
Okay.
I mean, do you use your student ID or your faculty ID to use these, or?
It would be
And
tied
if
to.
I came on campus?
Yeah, it'll be tied to a credit card account. So anyone with a credit card to use those, they actually have ways to do that without a smartphone or a credit card, where you can call in, you can text in, you can pay at other locations and prepay where you can call in. So they've got other options, but 99.9% of people will use a smartphone. They will download the app, they'll register a credit card, and when they use it, they'll scan the scooter, it'll turn it on, and they'll take off on the ride.
So on the app, does it signify whether you're a student or a faculty? I mean,
Anyone with an OK State EDU email address will be given a discounted rate, which is the 50 cents to start and 15 cents a minute afterwards instead of the $1 for the public. And that's $1.15 is pretty much the rate across the board for all the different companies. And so they're half price on the initial startup.
Thank you.
I was curious what your parking zones looked like, or how you were arranging those.
Oh, okay. On the front, the top picture, you'll see a parking area with 4 scooters in it. They will be similar to that. We've chosen just a black outline and just scooter parking only. We no signage or anything that's above ground, so that doesn't interfere with the aesthetics at OSU. But we will have surface decals, basically, so that they can be moved.
How did you determine where you located those? Are they in where bikes are on campus, or did you
lot of
situate
them.
them kind of?
A lot of them are
Together.
close to the bike racks, but not at the bike racks, but they're in high traffic areas, and our facilities management folks, they went out and looked for unused concrete, basically, where we wouldn't have to add concrete and we wouldn't have to take parking spaces, but we were willing to take parking spaces we needed to install basically a scooter corral, as you were. So we look for those locations all around the high frequency areas, classroom buildings, student union, all of those main traffic areas. Looking for convenience, so the students will use them.
Right, so they don't abandon them somewhere they're not
Exactly.
supposed to.
Counselors, further questions?
I just had one, and this may be a question better relegated for spin, but when the city rolls out their plan for this, these things are predicated on a geofence around campus. So I assume that geofence is around the campus boundary. So anything that goes off the campus boundary, i.e. into the city of Stillwater, it's limited. So how does that work when Stillwater kind of rolls out its plan? Is that, a long process? Is that, a button you flip and say, okay, now we've expanded our geofencing area? How does that work?
That's a very good question, but I know that SPIN has been in discussion with the city, and hopefully they'll have that worked out before we launch next week. So hopefully we won't have to restrict them to campus, but
Right.
yeah, as we've learned from Bird being here, the geofencing is good, but it's limited to the technology.
Mm-hmm.
So some of their stuff was restricted, they said, but I've got 394 of them to prove that they
Wait,
still
are you,
grow
are you
on
telling me that
campus.
Bird told you something that was not true?
Maybe.
I know that.
Join the club.
Counselor, the other point, we are entering into an interim contract with SPIN that addresses the very issues that you just asked, and they will be treated basically the same as they are on OSU's campus, and we'll kind of get into that when we talk about the ordinance in a few minutes.
Perfect.
Further questions, counselors? I have just one. How much did the fact that their logo is orange go into this decision?
You know, we really thought that was a good plus.
Yeah, just coincidence, right? That-
In the RFP, we did require that we would approve the coloring, because there are some out there that are a little bit red colored.
Ugh, yeah, want that.
We weren't going to have that.
It's good to know. Well, thank you all for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Appreciate the information. Yes, sir.
One thing that we are keeping in mind is it's always nice at the beginning of a contract and everyone's getting along. We'll monitor this and manage it going forward, and if it doesn't work or doesn't fit, it doesn't mean this is forever. So we're just going to try it, see how it works. Maybe 200 scooters is plenty, maybe we increase the number, maybe we dial it back. We're learning with this.
Is there any sort of criteria around when you're going to increase or decrease, or is it all just sort of, I mean, if
The
they're
usage
hitting,
experience will determine all that.
Okay.
The ridership.
there's no automatic
No.
increases or
Based
anything?
off the ridership and with our approval.
So, just in conjunction, maybe this, we're going to talk about this in a second, but if they're putting them in the city as well, potentially they could have 300 in the city, but only 200 of them permitted on campus?
Yes.
Okay.
We are charging them a fee to be on the campus.
Based on the number of scooters.
Per scooter, right?
Per scooter?
Per scooter.
Is there a way to know? So if they have 300 of them in the city, but only 200 of them are permitted to go onto campus, is there a way to control that? Or are they
We will-
basically just going to have the number in town that
We
they're
will
allowed on
have
campus?
access to all of their reporting data, so they will share that with us, and we'll be able to see how many were in operation any given day.
Okay.
As I understand it, these things actually have a VIN, if you will,
Yeah,
that's
basically-
unique to the scooter.
A digital serial number, basically, so.
So then, those 200 are just limited to campus? They can't,
If they've got everything in place
they
this
would be
week
able to come
before we
out?
launch, they will be able to go
But
both
only
on and off
those would be
campus.
able to come back onto campus?
We're not
in
married to
essence.
300. We could actually start with 200 in the ordinance. That's kind of up to you. And for that matter, we could put 200 in the interim agreement if that's what you want to do, just to be consistent with OSU.
Yeah, I mean, my concern is if we let them have more in the city than they're allowed to have on campus, then is there a way for you all to tell that they're not driving more than 200 on campus? And it sounds like they probably can. I mean, with the geofence and with the individual tracking, you'll be able to look at a report and say, well, this one wasn't permitted on campus, but it crossed the geofence.
I think we can, and I think with the vendor that we chose, that they have the integrity that we can trust that they're going to share with us and do what we ask.
And they did assure us that their initial deployment would be limited to 200 in the city. So
Okay.
whatever goes to OSU, that's the total number that will be in town.
Okay.
I was just wondering if if it was an OSU VIN number and it left campus, then there's only 199. I was just wondering how would you, if you picked one up in another spot, how would it go to campus? Does that make sense?
A little bit. Our intention is that they're shared. You know, it's one group, whether it's 200 or 300, and it's on campus and in the city, and they go in between, and the city's getting paid for what's used in the city, and we're getting paid for what's used on campus.
Okay.
We definitely want to partner with the city and
Sure.
one vendor that can supply all our needs.
I agree.
Good. Well, we appreciate the work you guys have done on this and going through and doing this
Thank you for
process.
having
And
us.
hopefully it works out well.
And
Thank you all.
we really appreciate them coming tonight because Mr. Weaver had indicated that he would be willing to get his crew down here to tell us, and I thought it would be a good time when we were looking at that ordinance.
Yeah,
So thanks for
absolutely.
coming.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, that takes us to item 7A, ordinances on first reading. This is ordinance number 3428. An ordinance of the City of Stillwater, Oklahoma, amending Title 37 of the Stillwater City Code, streets, sidewalks, and other public places, by the addition of Article 5 entitled Shared Active Transportation, stating its purpose and intent, providing definitions, setting forth permitting and fee requirements, establishing shared active transportation procedures, stating parking, safety, maintenance, and operation requirements, requiring service to underserved areas of the city, setting forth data collection and reporting functions, requiring appropriate insurance and other guarantees, and allowing for termination, repealing any conflicting ordinances, and providing for severability. This is a title-only reading at this point.
Yes. And I apologize for, it's taken a while to kind of get all everybody's input back on this. So if you decide you want to delay the first read until the first meeting in February, that's not a problem. That might give the public another month or two or another couple of weeks anyways, to have a look at it. But if you want me to, I'll go ahead and walk through this with you just to kind of give you a flavor for what we're working on. This is modeled after Tulsa's ordinance that was passed last fall, and Tulsa has the distinction of actually having put together an ordinance without Byrd already being there. And because most cities had to do it well, you know the circumstances under which we were operating. Tulsa, fortunately, was not picked for the first round of the Byrd deployment, so they had time to actually sit down and work through this. Their ordinance was actually written in the context of some shared bike service problems that they had encountered, and we're trying to resolve those. So it's more comprehensive than just a scooter ordinance itself. I would tell you that I have been working with VPAC, and I've gotten input from Regents Council, and within the context of working with VPAC, we are also looking at some amendments to the bicycle ordinance. But I'm holding that right now because there are two bills in the legislature that will impact the definitional coverage of those. So until we find out where they're going with that, we're going to hold the bicycle part of that. But that ordinance probably will be coming forth sometime this spring once we know where those other legislative actions are going. The ordinance is broken into, obviously, a number of sections. The definitional section, I will tell you, is unique to this specific article in Chapter 37. There's only one true shared definition, and that's the definition of bicycle, which is shared with the definition that is in Article 29, or excuse me, Chapter 29, which is the traffic code. Everything else is unique to this, and so the reason that we went ahead and stayed with the unique definitional structure is because it helps to define specifically how each one of these things interacts with the other. And I won't go through and talk about what each one of them are, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. Basically, this next section requires that they have permits before they can operate on city right-of-way. And the permits are good for a year. It establishes a fee structure, and the fee structure is different than the one that we are using in the interim agreements right now. The Byrd model, which everyone refers to, required the payment of $1 per scooter per day as long as it was deployed. We have replaced that with just an annual fee of $20. So if they bring a scooter to town, for example, Spin would be bringing 200 scooters to town. Under this ordinance, they would pay $20 for each scooter that they're bringing to town, whether they used it or not. So if they were to reduce the size, for example, to 150, you still would have collected that fee. If they increase the deployment, if they go from 200 to 300, they'll have to make an application to change that, and you'll get the additional funds for the additional scooters. So that is a change, and so you don't have the rebalancing of the inventory all the time that you have under that other formula that the Byrd was using. There's also a $30 per scooter public infrastructure fee. So rather than to pay a flat $500 public infrastructure fee, it's based again on the size of the deployment. So again, if in the case of Spin, that would be $20 or 200 times $30. Would be their initial fee for the use of the public infrastructure for a period of 1 year. And that's an annual fee, so you'll receive that each year.
Is that per calendar year?
Yes.
So if they deployed, for example, they deployed one on December 24th,
they'll pay us again on January 1st.
Okay.
Then there is, Tulsa has a provision in here for free operators, and this is based on the fact that in Tulsa, St. Francis Hospital has a set of bicycles that are used in parts of town, and so does the University of Tulsa, and they do not charge a fee for the use of those bicycles. So in the instance where you have free transportation, then we don't charge the fees for those. They're still subject to some of the permitting requirements. They don't have to pay for the permits, but we do want to know that they're using the right-of-way, and they're also subject to the requirements as to placement in the right-of-way, so that you can't just go put a bike rack up wherever you want to, which was the situation in Tulsa and prompted Tulsa looking at some kind of ordinance for this. The next section deals with the procedure. And basically, it talks about the difference between docks and dockless, and basically, they both provide for operation on the public right-of-way. The docked systems are supposedly have stationary locations where they're parked. In Houston, for example, they have these e-bikes, and you go and you park them in a docking station, and it recharges the bicycle. Most other places that have the dock type systems, it's not necessarily a charging system, it's a fancy bike rack, for lack of a better term. The dockless, by design, you did not necessarily have a specific location where you park them. However, and I'm very, very happy that OSU is doing this, so I see no reason not to carry this right on into the city. We're recommending in this ordinance that instead of being able to just drop the bike or the scooters just anywhere, which is the source of many, many complaints, is that we will designate areas where the parked scooters, the unrented parked scooters go. And this is the example that I've actually seen this in some literature from some other cities. But this is a great way to do it right here. And Norman and I had a conversation this afternoon about trying to figure out where these are going to go. And I have a feeling that's going to be harder than we think. But in the end, it will solve a whole lot of problems. So my recommendation, and the way it appears in this ordinance, is that we just carry that practice forward on into the community. So it's consistent both on the campus and in town. In 37305, it talks about having staffed operations, and that that there's various requirements for identification of the scooters and the bicycles. And it gives the city the ability to always remove them whenever they are located in an unsafe situation or constitute an obstruction of a public way, which has been a persistent problem in the community. I think Norman, did you have about 200 in your pile of bird scooters?
Oh, easily, yes.
We've collected quite a few ourselves, and it wasn't a competition with OSU, it just happened. Fleet size requirements, I have 300 in here. We can change that number. I had to start somewhere, and that's kind of the standard number that everyone's using. So I'm at 300. If you want to make it less, you want to make it more, we can certainly adjust that number. And then there's provisions for increasing them. Now, in this ordinance, we have 3 times per day. In the contract that OSU has with Spin, theirs is 4 to 6 times per day before they'll even consider an adjustment. So we could be consistent and up that number if you want to. There's no law that says how many you have to have. It's just that is a common number that's used in the cities that have addressed this so far. But we can certainly adjust that number if you decide that you want to do that. Parking, 37307, that's kind of the meat of this. And as I mentioned on B here, the dockless scooters would have a designated area, and we could paint them we could paint them a color consistent with what OSU is using. I mean, that seems to be a logical choice. And even the way they have it on this one, that's not an unattractive thing. And if it's sitting next to a bus stop, or it's in a kind of an obscure part of sidewalk furnishing, then that might not be a bad way to do it.
Does the this might be a question for our OSU folks, but does the app show you where the parking zones are? Does it?
It will.
Yeah, okay. So people can find it. They don't have to drive around looking for something painted on the sidewalk. They know where they can park.
We have a section here on C, and this addresses a problem that we've received a lot of comments on, and that is the scooters being dropped in neighborhoods. And there's actually two scenarios. One scenario is where they're actually setting up nests, for lack of a better term, right in people's front yards. And there were some scenarios like that in the Westwood area and in some of the other neighborhoods surrounding the university. We got some complaints about that. I know one individual who actually complained directly to Byrd and basically was told that, we'll take care of it, and of course, they never did. But that seems to be an issue, and given that the easements over which they operate are actually designed and intended legally for transportation and movement, actually setting up a business on a public right-of-way in front of somebody's house, that's inconsistent with the use of the easement or the right-of-way. So that's probably a valid argument. So I think that this is a necessary provision. The other thing is just dropping the scooters right in front of somebody's house. And there were some issues about houses that were near the Strip, Washington Street, and students leaving there at night, and it's kind of dark in some of those areas, and trip and fall possibilities because the scooters were just left there. So what I'm proposing here is that basically you're prohibited from dropping them in those residential areas unless you actually have a designated parking spot there. Now, by residential, we're talking only about single-family and duplex-type homes. We're not talking about apartment complexes, because obviously those would be target areas to put the scooters to begin with. And so we think that this might be a reasonable compromise. Let's see. Then there's
Can
I'm
the
sorry.
people who own apartment complexes be encouraged to provide their own parking space?
Yes, and I think we would encourage them to do that. And in fact, property owners could lease a little piece of ground right next to the sidewalk to put those on if they want to. I don't know that we don't really have any ordinances that govern parking of scooters on grass, but I mean, you can't park cars there, but it's something that you might think about. But there's nothing to keep private property owners from working out arrangements under this ordinance. It's just simply the use of the public right-of-way.
Does a parking space hold so many scooters? I mean, there's 4 here. Can it hold?
They can be bigger.
So that it can be 10, 12? I mean, it can be as many scooters as you can fit.
Sure.
Okay.
I've heard of them.
Parking space was a certain amount of scooters that could go in that.
I think that it'll hold whatever it will hold. And of course, we don't want to get into a scenario where they're just stacking them in there either, because then we may want to re-examine how we've designed the parking area. I mean, there'll be a trial and error element to it, I'm certain. But the remainder of 307 talks about impeding traffic, and it gives the city the right to pick up, again, these scooters that are not parked properly, and it assesses a $5 per day per scooter charge for the city to pick them up, because, I mean, we have to send staff out to do that, and so we should be able to recover a reasonable fee. That, by the way, is the amount that is in all of the current interim agreements. So it's something the industry's already accepted. 308 dealt with safety requirements. Now, if you looked at the Tulsa ordinance, which is the one that I sent out, the working version, you'll notice that I took a lot of that out. And Tulsa has referred to a bunch of standards that will continue to change, whereas the state statutes do have certain standards with respect to bicycles and vehicles of that type. And so the way we've amended this was to basically sync it up with the state statutes, because I don't think we have the ability here to decide whether, ASTM number whatever is the proper way to address this issue with respect to safety. So we've adopted those kind of by reference. In 37309, there's some language in there about rebalancing the fleet every day, and to try to put a certain number of scooters into areas that might be otherwise underserved. I don't want to say economically distressed areas, but to also make sure that there were scooters all over town so that everyone could use them that needed to use them. And so that, again, is something that you can decide whether to leave that in or not. But we think that there probably are parts of town where those might very well be welcome. So until we put them out, at least we can put the parking areas out there, and then we see what happens, I guess. There's the data sharing provision, which is this language that we have in here is very similar to what's in the agreements. And I think that's been very useful for a lot of cities. It kind of helps you understand how these things are being used. Insurance requirements are fairly standard. There's a provision in here that does allow the council to revoke a permit. There's a provision in here that allows the manager to revoke and then appeal to the council. So that's it in a nutshell. Any other questions or?
Councilors, questions for Mr. Dorman? So do you want to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out a couple of things.
Go ahead.
That I want to make sure that everybody knows. One, they're not, in this ordinance, scooters will not be able to park on a sidewalk where bicycles are prohibited. So the downtown area, there could be no scooters on the sidewalk. Doesn't prohibit them from being operated on the street downtown. And if we put availability zones there, I just want to point out we're going to lose some parking spaces around town. In some areas that don't have, that where where they're prohibited, or two, that don't have that, and I always mess this up, furnishings. Close. To park next to. So we may.
You're saying since they can't be ridden on the sidewalks downtown, we're not going to put parking areas on the sidewalks downtown?
That's the way the ordinance is currently written, yes.
Right, because we don't really have areas on the sidewalks where they can go very neatly. I mean, we have some wider spots, and I know that there are a few buildings that they have been parked in front of, but if you've noticed, they've been kind of lined up one behind the other, and BPAC in particular focused on that and said, we really don't like that because that has created issues for persons who are in wheelchairs, and it's not, that mechanism, that method of parking is not particularly good. So there aren't a lot of places downtown where there's enough room to put them.
Unless you took some parking spaces.
Right. We'd have to
put
take
bicycle parking in those as well. So, I mean, you could.
combine, yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
And we currently allow bicycles to park on the sidewalk downtown.
Yeah.
We have racks, so.
That's my question from an ordinance standpoint is, I'm not sure it makes sense to say we're not going to put a parking spot. I mean, you can only park them where we put the parking spot, and if we figure in a specific area because of the geography, it really does make sense to put a parking spot on the sidewalk. I'm not sure why we would keep ourselves from being able to do that. Like if it makes sense to do it. I mean, people park their bike on the sidewalk, but they know they can't ride it on the sidewalk.
I think the intent behind Mr. Norman putting that in is that BPAC was very, very vocal.
Sure, but I mean, we
issue.
would make sure that wherever that spot is designated, everybody's okay with it before we designate it. I just want us to be able to have as much flexibility as we can in determining those spots, because there may be a couple spots downtown where it does make sense on the sidewalk, there's room, and everybody sees it as a reasonable place to put it. So I guess I would want to make sure we have as much flexibility as we can have in determining parking spots.
Okay, we can work on that.
And finally, the geofencing, the ordinance allows me to make a decision where we would geofence those items. And right now, that would be downtown, Commercial District, Washington Street, and Campus Corner. So.
And that would be where we restrict speed on them?
We would restrict them from being able to be operated on the sidewalk, period. Speed probably.
They
Pardon?
can ride on the street.
They can ride in the street.
But we can geofence them off the sidewalk?
I believe we can. I believe you can get it that close.
Does the geofencing work? So it's not, I guess I imagine the geofencing to be an area, not as refined as a corridor along a street.
I don't know.
Sidewalk. Do you guys, I'm sorry, are we allowed to ask you, do you know?
I was going to say.
No, it's not, but one of the operators other than Spin told me that they could do that they had that technology, especially since there's angle parking there, and it allows enough width for some error in the GPS system.
Spin indicated that plus or minus about 6 feet was about how close they hoped to get.
Right, and with a 17 to 19 foot angled space downtown, that ought to give them enough room to prohibit them on the sidewalk. So.
I kind of feel that, we want to encourage people to come downtown by any means. And if we have, let's just say students using scooters, we don't want to prohibit them from being able to come downtown.
No, it wouldn't prohibit them from coming downtown. They can ride them in the street, and we currently have an ordinance that prohibits bicycles in the central business districts because of the.
Geofencing is that acutely honed that it does not prohibit them
Right.
from riding in the street.
Right. We want them to come downtown. It would just keep them off the sidewalk.
Yeah, if that works, that makes some sense. Is that in the ordinance, that part of it? Or is
It
that
just says you can't park them anywhere where they're prohibited to be operated, is actually the way it says it. But we can play with that language.
Of course, if you open up the sidewalk, if you loosen that language to maybe park them on the sidewalks in certain areas, then if you've already geofenced that part off, you run into another problem there.
Well,
right?
Yeah,
They
go ahead.
They just wouldn't operate if. I'm probably not explaining this right, but if at the end of the parking space, if you go further towards the sidewalk than the end of the angled parking spaces downtown, the device would die. Mm-hmm. It just wouldn't run. It would run in the street area, in the street travel area, but not in the parking spaces in the sidewalk.
So then the question would be is if you had a parking spot on the sidewalk,
Just push it
you
up
have
there.
to push it off of that
Right.
space.
To get it going.
Push it up there and park it, yes.
Okay, so the parking issue, I think
Okay.
we can talk about whether we need to just change that to say they can't be parked anywhere except for the designated parking zone, which could be on a sidewalk if it makes sense. Is the issue of geofencing the sidewalks out an ordinance issue, or is that just something we're talking about with them?
It just says
It
that
just
the
says they
manager
can't.
It says the manager can require geofencing in certain areas where the operation might be prohibited.
So if we figure out, though, that it's too fuzzy to make that operational, we just wouldn't require it.
Sure.
We're not required to make it that way under the ordinance.
It's not. It
No.
works either way. Just an element of discretion given to the manager.
Okay.
And when we say parking, we're just talking about parking spots on public right of way, right?
Yeah, if some enterprising individual might want to have a big lot for them, if they want to
Well, I was
do
just
that on their
thinking,
private
We
property.
don't want to give the impression that that's the only place right? If I want to go to the grocery store on a scooter and I want to park it,
Sure.
right? I don't want to give the impression that you can't go anywhere on the scooter
Sure.
because there's no place to park.
Because there's no place to park it. They keep going around.
You just have to do your shopping on the
big
scooter
circle.
while you're doing
Because
it.
I think OSU has, right, they have a unique, maybe less complicated challenge, I'm sure, not to diminish your work, but because the students are there kind of for a specific purpose on campus, and there's certain hot spots on campus. Obviously, with the commerce in the whole city, that's a little different for us to kind of plan for, but.
Yeah, the idea with the parking spots is just saying you can't leave them in public right away unless they're in a spot.
Okay.
But if you're parking them on private right away and you have permission, if you have private land and you have permission to do it, you can put them wherever you want.
Sure, and again, most of the prohibitions deal with scooters that are available for rent. When you're done with, while you're riding them, if you want to pull them right up to your friend's house front door or the apartment or wherever it is you're going, you're fine, as long as it's not obstructing the way. There's no issue.
Yep.
When they're ready, when they're I hate to use the word abandoned, but when they're available for hire and they're parked wherever they are supposed to be. That's really the big issue that we run into. It's not the ones that are in use.
Yep. Okay, so this is on for first reading now, but were you suggesting earlier that we should maybe push it to first reading on the 4th?
It's up to you. If you think this thing has been vetted enough, we can read the title tonight. And my concern is that there would be substantial changes to this between the reads, because then we would end up having to first read it again.
Yeah.
But if we don't have, I mean, what I'm hearing tonight is fairly minor stuff, and certainly within the areas that we've already put out for the public to view. So it's kind of up to you. We're not in a place where we have to have the ordinance on the books immediately. We have an interim agreement with SPIN, so it's a 90-day agreement, so we have a little bit of time to get this right.
When does that agreement expire?
It's a 90-day agreement. So
Starting.
it would expire, assuming Norman signs it this week, it'll expire probably the first part of May.
I mean, if that's the case, I don't see a problem holding this off for a couple of weeks so that we can kind of, get a little more insight into it personally.
Sure. Do we need to make a motion to read it, or do we just?
No, we don't have to do anything. You've read it, but if you don't vote on it, then it's not advanced to second reading. So you can read it again. You have to read it 3 times. That's the downside.
That's my favorite part of these meetings.
This, actually.
All right, does anybody want to make a motion in terms of first reading on this one, or we want to hold that off and do it later? I'm going to take that as a no.
Well, are we thinking there's going to be some major changes? I don't.
I don't know that there is, but
I
we hadn't really discussed it in full, and with OSU just putting it out there, there's going to be a lot more public interest in how it's exactly going to work. So, just giving the public another couple weeks to let us know if they
I would
if
suggest
they
that
see
we keep it
anything.
consistent with OSU as far as
Sure.
the
Oh,
numbers and how things are done, just so that there's a little less confusion created.
Well, and just to be clear, I agree with that, but there's nothing in our ordinance that requires a scooter that they want to come and drop. If Bird wanted to come back and apply for a permit to be permitted in the city, they could. We could have a second scooter vendor in the city.
Oh, certainly.
Right. They wouldn't be able to take theirs onto OSU's campus unless they got another additional permit from OSU. But we could potentially have 2 or 3 scooter companies that operate in the city and just don't go onto campus.
That's correct.
This ordinance isn't tied to somebody that OSU's already accepted.
That's correct.
Not that, of course, as soon as we saw them not being allowed on OSU campus, they were all not here anymore. So, but just to be clear. Okay, so.
Mayor had one, I'm sorry to call OSU out again, but I had one last question for you all. How long is your RFP? What's the term of your RFP?
1 year with 4 renewal.
So 1 year with an option to renew for up to 4 more years, so 5 years total, but you evaluate after that year?
Yes, and we also have ability to break the contract if we want to have it.
Okay.
All right, any more comment or discussion on 7A? That takes us to ordinance 3429, item 7B. On first reading, an ordinance rezoning attractive land located at 1309 West University Avenue as more particularly described in this ordinance from RMI Residential Multifamily Intermediate to RMU Residential Multifamily Urban Classification. Councilors?
Motion to, go ahead.
Yeah, no.
Motion to advance ordinance 3429 to second reading.
Second.
We have a motion and a second to advance the ordinance to second reading. Please vote. With a vote of 5-0, ordinance 3429 is advanced to second reading. Item 8, reports from officers and boards. Mr. Dorman.
A couple of items, sir. Request an executive session pursuant to 25 OS subsection 307B2 to discuss labor negotiations with Fraternal Order of Police Lodge number 102. And the second item, same section with International Association of Firefighters Local number 2095.
Thank you, Mr. Dorman. Mr. McNichol.
2 items, Mayor. One, we welcome 2 new city employees, Brandon Vesser, Airport Operations Specialist, and Walt Sumner, Entry Power Systems Technician for the electric utility, and we're glad that they chose to come to work for Stillwater to serve our citizens. Second item, the main contractor for the skate park at Strickland Park has finished their work. They have completed their work and they're gone.
So that means it's open for business?
It does not. The area remains fenced off so city crews can complete the project. And unfortunately, those fences have been knocked down a few times and people are using the park. And that is delaying the project even further. So we would appreciate it if, we know this has been a long-term project and people are eager to use that facility, but we would appreciate it if people would stay out. They actually are creating, in some cases, some minor damage, and they are subject to trespassing arrest if they get caught in there. So we would appreciate it if people would just be patient for about another month.
About another month?
Yes, sir.
Do we have a
mid-February.
Mid-February? Well, it is an exciting addition to Stillwater, and certainly happy about the work that's been done, but please let us finish up before you get in there and use it.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Councilor Zanotti.
Yes, I would like to remind you that we are entering budget season. If you haven't already done so, visit the city's online financial center at stillwater.org. There's information about how the budget is developed and an explanation of the budget cycle. Be sure to try your hand at balancing the city's budget with Balancing Act.
Thank you, Councilor. Vice Mayor Darlington.
You may not know this, but city staff announces scheduled road closures and water service interruptions every Friday to give you a heads up and to help you plan routes. These are printed in the news press, or you can go to stillwater.org and click on the road closings and water and electric outages link so you can make sure you don't get stuck someplace behind a barrier.
I think they also go up on our Facebook pages and Twitter, and are all over the place.
All over the place.
Thank you. Councilor Wedlake.
Thank you, sir. The 14th annual Dancing with Daughter dance is on Friday, February 8th and Saturday, February 9th at the Stillwater Community Center. If you are interested, tickets are available through February 6th online at stillwater.org or at the Community Center for $25 per couple or an extra $10 per each additional daughter. Are you going?
Absolutely.
Me too. Which day are you going?
I don't know yet.
Really?
Yeah, we haven't got tickets yet, but
We're going.
we drove by the sign the other day, and my daughter said, make sure you get a ticket.
Absolutely.
She loves it. Councilor Jaloski.
The city has just launched a new podcast called FYI Stillwater. You can listen to it on iTunes, Spotify, or at fyistillwater.podbean.com. How cool are we on iTunes and Spotify? There are 4 30-minute episodes as of today with topics about the city's special events process, emergency management overview, zoning concerning medical marijuana dispensaries, and community assistance for help with your city utility bill. And new episodes are in the works.
Excellent. That's really cool. I have a note here that for our weekly city statistic, the city operates and maintains 7,259 distribution transformers that bring electricity to all of our homes. That's quite a bit of maintenance and equipment to maintain. All right. That takes us to item 10, I suppose. Is there a motion to enter executive session?
Motion to enter executive session.
We have a motion and a second to enter executive session. Please vote. With a vote of 5-0, we'll now enter executive session. Thank you all for being here.